We're going to talk about why we believe it's important to consider affordability, scalability, and efficiency from the outset of a project developing an intervention. I'll talk about most and how you can achieve intervention ease via optimization. I'll kind of fantasize a little bit about what would happen if all interventions were optimized. That's something I like to think about a lot. And then we'll talk about the goals of the new center, Cadio. So here's a schematic of the classical treatment package approach. And this, I think you're all familiar with this because it's kind of standard operating procedure in intervention science. There's a bunch of components. I have 5 here, could be any number of components. They're identified and maybe pilot tested, and then immediately they are assembled into an intervention that's represented by that black box there. And then the intervention is evaluated by means of a standard RCT. And that's a particular kind of, by RCT, we're talking here about a particular kind of experimental design where there's usually 2 arms, sometimes 3 arms, occasionally more than 3, but usually 2. And participants are randomly assigned to either a treatment or a control, and the purpose is a direct comparison of the mean of the treatment group to the mean of the control group as a way of assessing the performance of the intervention that's represented by that black box. Now, I want to stress that those of us working in the area of intervention optimization are definitely not anti-RCT. We're just pro using the appropriate experimental design for the question at hand, and anti limiting the research questions you ask by limiting yourself to one type of experimental design. The RCT is great at assessing the performance of the intervention as a package, but it's not suited to examine the performance of individual components, and definitely not suited to assessing whether components interact. So that's one issue with the treatment package approach. It's sole reliance on the RCT. And again, we're not saying don't rely on the RCT. We're just saying don't rely solely on the RCT. And a second issue is that affordability, scalability, and efficiency, which we think are important considerations, are not considered until after the evaluation. Now, at that point, after the evaluation, the intervention is a done deal, and any modifications you would have to make, it's just hard to know what to do. So let's explore those ideas a little bit. So let's consider the consequences of not considering affordability from the outset. So we're going to define affordability as the extent to which the intervention is effective without exceeding budgetary constraints. So you might have some identified upper limit on the per person cost of an intervention, for example, and you want an intervention that will not exceed that limit. So what are the consequences of not considering that from the outset? Well, many interventions are never implemented because they're just too expensive. So after the treatment package is evaluated in the RCT, maybe a cost effectiveness analysis is done, and it's too expensive, or it's not cost effective. Or the other thing that happens is an intervention is brought to whatever situation it's going to be implemented in, and the people who are kind of in charge in that situation say, wait a minute, we can't afford this. Maybe, the first time it was free, but they said, okay, you go along with this. And they realize, wait, this is really stretching our budget. So what happens? Parts of the intervention end up getting removed, and that seriously undermines the effectiveness of the intervention. It may even wipe it out altogether. If you don't know anything about the effectiveness of individual components, you don't know what's the right one to take out. It could be that a component you removed was largely responsible for the effect that was observed in an RCT. Much the same can be said about considering scalability. We're going to define scalability as the extent to which the intervention can be implemented widely with fidelity. And by fidelity, we mean exactly as it was evaluated originally, exactly as it was evaluated. So again, many interventions end up never being implemented because when push comes to shove, it's realized, well, this is a great intervention, but it's just not practical to implement. Or the people who are responsible for implementing it after it's been evaluated say, this just is not practical to implement. We're going to have to simplify it for our staff to be able to handle it. They just won't have time in their busy and stressful days. So one or more components are taken out, and you just don't know how much that undermines the effectiveness. This is a reality. This is something that Kate and I have discussed a number of times with on the ground intervention providers. We're hearing more and more people kind of coming out and admitting, yes, we have to do that sometimes. Efficiency is a little bit different, but I would say equally important. We're defining that as the extent to which the intervention avoids wasting time, money, or other valuable resources. So let's say you're an academic intervention scientist and you're developing an intervention, and you want to get a significant effect on an RCT, right? That's kind of a main goal for you. And you have little incentive to consider cost or scalability, right? I mean, that is really not something that's discussed at the point where you're developing an intervention in an R01 or something like that. So you'd be crazy not to include as many components as you can think of that have a reasonable chance of affecting the outcome. As a consequence, many interventions likely include useless or even counterproductive components. There's really no disincentive for including useless or counterproductive components. So to sum up, many interventions are too expensive or otherwise impractical, or to make them affordable or practical, they've been subject to ad hoc alterations that undermine their effectiveness to an unknown degree. And they likely include useless or even counterproductive components. And man, sometimes I think if we could have that money back that's devoted to useless and counterproductive components, think of what we could do in public health and education. It would be amazing. So is it any wonder that, as Lisa Onken of NIH said, so many efficacious behavioral interventions do not make their way down the pipeline through implementation? And this is, I think, in some ways, kind of a national disgrace, because I know I'm speaking strongly here, but when I think of how many hundreds of millions of dollars have been put into developing interventions that have never made their way down the pipeline through implementation, it's kind of frustrating to think about that. So next, let me talk about MOST, my favorite subject, and achieving intervention ease through optimization. Now, what's intervention ease? It's an acronym. It's a strategic balance of effectiveness, affordability, scalability, and efficiency. So ease is achieved by balancing effectiveness against affordability, scalability, and efficiency. Now, those are in some ways kind of opposing forces, because if you don't worry about affordability, you don't worry about scalability, and those two in particular, then you can develop an intervention that would be super effective, super potent, but it would probably end up having a net public health impact of 0 or near 0 because it would never be implemented. And public health impact, as you know, is a function of both intervention effectiveness and intervention reach. So if the reach is 0, public health impact is going to be 0, no matter how effective the intervention is. So when we talk about intervention ease, we're talking about the strategic balance of these sometimes competing considerations, and it's mainly effectiveness competing against the others. So you might say, well, Linda, sure, it's great to think about doing this, but how would you do it? And we'd like to suggest you can accomplish this by optimizing interventions using the multi-phase optimization strategy. So let's talk about optimization for a minute before we kind of launch into MOST. I want to offer a definition of optimization, and then I want to make 2 points about optimization. And this idea of a definition, I'm seeing the word optimization used a lot in behavioral science these days. And I just would like to implore all of you, if you use optimization in your work, define it clearly. I don't think you necessarily have to use my definition, because optimization is a broad term, but I think you need, whenever it's used, a definition so that it's clear exactly what you're talking about. Our definition of optimization is this one you see on your screen. It's the process of identifying this strategic balance we talked about of effectiveness against affordability, scalability, and efficiency. Here's the first point. Optimization is not about finding the absolute best, which makes our use of the term optimization a little different from how the word optimal is used in kind of colloquial conversation. So it's not about finding the absolute best. It's about the best you can actually use. So this is an engineering definition of optimization. Optimization is about, balancing things. The absolute best would probably be the most effective you could get if you didn't worry about cost, you didn't worry about practicality, scalability. But optimized is the most effective, subject to realistic constraints on things like willingness to pay, available staff time, a tolerable level of complexity for staff and participants, and any other constraints you can think of. The second point I want to make is that there may not be one single optimal intervention. What's optimal may vary across settings and across time. And that's completely appropriate. This is a schematic of the multi-phase optimization strategy. Some of you may have seen this before. It's adapted with a few small changes from my book. And all of this is a work in progress. And I think we're going to be seeing some more minor changes to this figure in the coming years. But the basic idea of these three phases, preparation, optimization, and evaluation, that's the essence of it. And I think that I'd be surprised if that changes in any significant way. So the first phase is preparation. And a lot of this is going to seem familiar to you because it's, first of all, common sense. And secondly, what most intervention scientists do anyway. Derive and revise, as the case may be, a conceptual model, a detailed conceptual model. Identify a set of what we call candidate intervention components. And we call them candidate components because it's not a foregone conclusion that they're going to eventually make their way into the optimized intervention. So they're candidates for inclusion in the intervention. You're kind of going to audition them, so to speak, in the optimization trial. Any pilot work is conducted in the preparation phase. And I want to make the point that optimization trials, which we're going to get to in a moment, are not pilot studies. So any pilot work is done here in the preparation phase. And then the thing that's maybe a little different is in the preparation phase, you identify an optimization objective. And the optimization objective is kind of an operational definition of what you mean by intervention ease. So it might be most cost-effective intervention, or it might be the intervention that the set of components that gives you the best expected outcome, but costs less than $500 a person to implement. Or it might be the set of components that gives you the best expected outcome, but takes less than an hour to deliver. So those are just some examples. There's lots and lots and lots of different possibilities there. So again, that's your definition of ease. The next phase is optimization. In the optimization phase, you build the optimized intervention. And there's a lot of different types of experimental designs you can use, but they all assess the performance of individual components. So the factorial experiment, the fractional factorial experiment, the SMART, the micro-randomized trial, this is the system identification experiment, and other designs are starting to come online that are kind of hybrids of these different experimental designs. Any of those can be used. And I think there'll be more designs in the future. And once you've conducted the optimization trial, you use the results to identify the intervention that meets that optimization objective that you defined in the preparation phase. And the final phase is evaluation. And here you can, if you wish, confirm the effectiveness of the optimized intervention in a standard randomized control trial. And I just want to point out this little arrow going back to preparation. You see in that purple diamond, that's a decision point, and it poses the question, is the optimized intervention expected to be sufficiently effective? Now, of course, you hope that you identify a whole bunch of strong components and you would feel confident going ahead to an evaluation. But what if you only identify one or two components? What if you identify a bunch of components, but they're kind of weak? It actually would not even be ethical to go ahead and do the evaluation if you don't have if there's not a reasonable chance that the intervention would show a positive effect. So at that point, common sense says that you would go back to the preparation phase, reconsider the conceptual model, and possibly do some more pilot work, maybe identify a new optimization objective, maybe not, and go ahead and do another optimization trial. So in this way, MOST is a much more iterative approach to intervention development and evaluation. I'm going to now review an example of optimization of a smoking cessation intervention. I realize that this may seem kind of abstract up to now if you are not familiar with this area. So, but there have been lots and lots of studies funded, and this is one. So this study was conducted at the University of Wisconsin Center for Tobacco Research and Intervention, directed by Mike Fiore. And it was supported by a P50 grant. The team included Tim Baker, Megan Piper, Robin Mermelstein, and me, as well as a number of other people. And the objective was to arrive at, this project is over, the objective was to arrive at an efficient smoking cessation intervention made up of all active intervention components. I know I'm using the word phase in two different ways here, but Baker et al. Used a phased-based model of cessation, and the idea here is that there are different phases of smoking cessation, and different intervention components are relevant during different phases of cessation. This was a P50, so a relatively large study. We had 3 different projects, sort of the equivalent of 3 R01s working synergistically. And I'm going to talk about 2 of these projects here. We examined 11 components in 2 different optimization trials. These trials were conducted simultaneously in primary care settings, like doctor's offices in the Wisconsin area. And here are the candidate components we examined in this project. Some of them pertain to the preparation and cessation phases, and others pertain to the maintenance phase. So preparation and cessation are the weeks leading up to the quit date, and then a couple of weeks after the quit date. So preparation is before the quit date, cessation is after the quit date, and then maintenance is after the cessation phase when you've quit successfully but you're at risk for relapse. So preparation phase use of a nicotine patch could be on or off. Preparation phase use of oral NRT, this was in a lozenge form, on or off. Now I want to stop for a moment and make the point that everyone got nicotine replacement, which is standard of care, at the quit date. The question here was whether using nicotine replacement earlier during the preparation phase would lead to better outcomes. Preparation phase counseling, on or off. Cessation in-person counseling could be intensive versus minimal, so not on or off here, intensive versus minimal. Cessation phase phone counseling, intensive versus minimal, and duration of medication could be 16 weeks or 8 weeks. So that was one experiment. Second experiment looked at 5 different candidate components. Extended medication, 26 weeks versus 8 weeks. Remember, everybody got medication starting at the quit date. Maintenance counseling via telephone, on versus off. Medication adherence counseling, 2 10-minute sessions versus none. Automated medication adherence calls, on versus off. And then helping hands, this was like a MEMS cap type device, but it was just a little bit different. And people got this helping hands MEMS cap type device with counseling for their nicotine replacement medication. And some people got a printout feedback and counseling versus none. Everybody got the helping hand, but some people got kind of some other features with it. Okay, so we examined these components in 2 separate optimization trials. As I said, the maintenance phase experiment was a 2 to the 5th. And what do I mean by that? That was a 2 by 2 by 2 by 2 by 2 factorial experiment. This one, the preparation and cessation phase experiment, was a 2 by 2 by 2 by 2 by 2 by 2. You see why we use this exponential notation. It gets a lot easier once you have more than 3 factors or so. That was actually a fractional factorial design. I'm not going to talk very much about fractional factorial designs. Maybe we'll have a future webinar about that. But I do want to point out that factorial experiments are a lot more efficient than people sometimes think they are. So let's review some possibilities that you might think of for examining intervention components. So you've got 6 intervention components on the table, and the question is, how does each one work? Well, the first thing you might think of, if you've been trained primarily in the classical treatment package approach, would be, I'll do a little RCT on each one. I'll do an RCT on the first component, then get some new participants and do an RCT on the second one, and so on. So if you did that, you would do 6 individual experiments here, and I'm just talking about the preparation and cessation phase experiment. So 6 individual experiments. That would be 12 experimental conditions altogether, treatment and control for each one. And you would need a little over 3,000 participants to power that. And of course, you could not look at interactions between components with that approach. The second option would be what's often called a comparative treatment experiment. You may know it by a different name. These experiments this particular type of experiment goes by a lot of different names. In this type of experiment, there's one control group, and then there would be 6 different treatment groups. It's basically a 7-arm RCT where in one condition, the first component is set to the higher level, and all the others are set to no or the lower level. Then in another treatment condition, the second component is set to the high level or yes, and all the other components are set to the lower level or no. So you get the idea. That this approach is a little bit more efficient. It requires only about 1,800 participants. There would be 7 experimental conditions, still no interactions. Or I should say, interactions are there, they just can't be disentangled. The third option would be a 2 to the 6th factorial experiment. And it may surprise you to see that this experiment would require only 512 participants to power. However, the downside perhaps is that 64 experimental conditions would be required, but you could look at all the interactions, which there's some advantages to that. What we actually ended up doing, I said we used a fractional factorial design. Fractional factorial experiments have exactly the same sample size requirements as standard factorial experiments, but they involve fewer experimental conditions. There's trade-offs there in fractional factorial designs. Certain effects are combined with others, so you can't necessarily estimate all of the effects, but you can still estimate some of the interactions in that kind of a design. Fractional factorial designs, that's a separate topic. But the main point here is how efficient the factorial experiment is. And if you've been trained primarily in the RCT, this might be a big surprise to you, but it's true, honest. I sometimes get asked whether it's possible to publish the results of an optimization trial. And yes, I'm showing you 2 publications here, but there have been a bunch of publications that have come out of these 2 optimization trials. So what were the winning components? The components that were selected were preparation oral RCT, the lozenge, not the patch, cessation in-person counseling at the intensive level, and then extended NRT, nicotine replacement therapy, 26 weeks, maintenance counseling via telephone, and automated medication adherence calls. which kind of surprised me. That one surprised me, but people actually like them. So then we put those components together. That was the optimized intervention. And we examined it in an RCT and found that it had a statistically and clinically significant effect. So I just kind of walked you through the optimization and evaluation phases of most, and I hope that made it a little more concrete for you. So now let's fantasize a little bit about if all interventions were optimized. Well, one outcome of that would be that interventions would be more efficient, less wasteful, and less burdensome, because the inactive components would be removed, and we wouldn't be wasting money on those components or time or effort. Intervention adaptation, that's a big topic these days, and it's also a very broad topic, and you can mean different things by intervention adaptation. But one way to accomplish a type of intervention adaptation, I don't think it doesn't answer every question about adaptation, but one way to adapt to individual settings or differences across settings is sometimes to optimize for individual settings by reusing data from a single optimization trial. So let me talk about that for a moment. Suppose you've conducted an optimization trial. You have the results. There were 5 components. I'll just call them 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And you have 2 different settings that you're interested in developing interventions in. And let's say that the results of the optimization trial can reasonably be assumed to generalize across these 2 settings. So setting A can afford $300 a person to implement the intervention. Well, with that upper limit on cost, let's say we optimize the intervention, and the optimized intervention includes components 1, 2, and 4. Now there's another setting, setting B, and unfortunately, setting B is not as resource rich. They can afford only $200 a person to implement the intervention. So when you optimize the intervention for the best expected outcome with an upper limit on cost of $200 a person, now the components that make up the optimized intervention are 1, 3, and 5. So these 2 interventions, the one for A and B, they have 1 component in common and 2 components are different. It's pretty easy to show that when you have a resource-rich and a resource-poor setting, however you define resources, if you optimize for each individual setting, you find that the components in the resource-poor settings are not necessarily a subset of the components in the resource-high settings. And my point here is that taking an intervention and then just removing components to make it affordable is a really bad idea. You do much better to optimize the intervention for the reduced affordability. I would say the progress through the NIH stages of intervention development will be accelerated in the long run. And in the long run, we always take the 10 or 15 year view. So I think progress from basic research to efficacy trials would be greatly accelerated. And then from effectiveness to implementation, I think would be accelerated because interventions that would be developed would be much closer to being implementable, scalable. There wouldn't have to be a long process to establish scalability. And also I want to point out that most can be used to optimize intervention and dissemination. If you think of intervention and dissemination as kind of its own intervention, a wraparound intervention, we can talk about that some more if you're interested. And I love this idea that interventions would become better and better over time. And I actually would love to see us start assigning version numbers to interventions, much the same way version numbers are assigned to software. This is intervention version 2.3, and intervention 2.4 is coming out next month, something like that. This is a quote from the NIA website. Intervention development is not complete until an intervention reaches its maximum level of potency and is implementable with a maximum number of individuals in the population for which it was developed. I love that quote, but I disagree with it a little bit, because I would say that intervention development is never complete, because we can always make an intervention better. I see there's something in the chat.
It's from me. It's okay.
Okay. Okay. And we would develop a solid foundation of knowledge about what works for whom and under what circumstances. And that's something we are missing currently in intervention science. I feel it's within reach, but not if we rely solely on the classical treatment package approach. That's my belief anyway. So I want to suggest that you do not buy these books because you can download PDF versions from the Springer portal for free at most research libraries. And the one on the left provides a comprehensive introduction to most. It's an authored book, authored by me. And the one on the right is an edited book that covers a number of advanced topics. And you may find these books useful to you in your work. Now, the goals of Cadio, the new center that we're launching this semester. The goals of Cadio are to promote and support optimization of all types of interventions, to establish a community of scholars interested in the science and application of intervention optimization, to extend and enhance intervention optimization methods of all kinds, to disseminate and provide training in current intervention optimization methods. There's more webinars coming up, and they're all going to be 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Coming up on February 15th in 2 weeks, mediation analysis on data from a factorial experiment. So interesting. This is a way of doing mediation analysis when you have data from a factorial optimization trial that will enable you to assess what mediates individual intervention components. And it's a little hard to get your mind around what I'm about to say next, but even interaction effects can be mediated. So that's something to think about. Doing these kinds of mediation analyses is not hard, assuming that you have data from a factorial experiment. And it's really, really useful, because if a component appeared to work, it will help you see how it worked. And if it didn't work, it will help you see where you went wrong. So for example, if the link between the component and the outcome is broken, that is to say the component has no effect on the outcome, is it the case that the component has an effect on the mediator, but the mediator did not have an effect on the outcome? That suggests that what you need is to find a different strategy altogether. You have to go back and reconsider your conceptual model, because you need to be targeting a different mediator. On the other hand, if the mediator affected the outcome, but the component did not affect the mediator, you need a different component. You can keep the mediator, but you need a different component. So Jillian Strayhorn will talk about that. Very interesting stuff. On March 1st, our colleague Maria Guads here at NYU will talk about a really interesting project that she has using MOST to develop an intervention to fight COVID-19, and in particular among unvaccinated Black and Latino essential frontline workers here in New York City. On March 22nd, Michael Lorber, again, a colleague of ours here at NYU, will talk about optimizing an evidence-based, disseminable, free, internet-based parenting program. And actually, what Michael is optimizing is what I would call a wraparound intervention, although I'm not sure that he uses that term. He's optimizing what will create engagement in the intervention. Now, engagement is just a huge issue right now when people talk about online intervention. So if you do any kind of online work in particular, I would really recommend tuning into Michael's webinar. On April 5th, Nick Dion Odom, who never disappoints, will talk about how you go from pilot to a full optimization trial. And Nick has a lot of experience in this area, and he is just has some amazing approaches to conducting an optimization trial minimizing protocol deviation. So if you want to conduct a tightly controlled optimization trial and end up with great data, I recommend tuning into that one. And then on May 3rd, Kate and I are coming back. The doctor is in as we launch the summer, just for an informal conversation. Think of your questions, write them down. Anything is fair game. You can even argue with me. I love to argue, so that would be fine if you want to have an argument. So if you want to register for our webinars, there's a code, one of those QR codes for you. So I'll just give you a moment to take a picture of that if you want to, a screenshot, or take out your cell phone, but you don't really need that because you can just go to cadio.org and it's pretty easy to find under events. And there's a Cadio Academy. We're very excited about this. We have developed a course, an online course on the Coursera platform. So this is a completely asynchronous course. And very soon we will be launching a second course. This one, this first one, is called Introduction to the Multi-Phase Optimization Strategy, but we're actually going to reboot it. And there are going to be two courses. We're changing the title of this one, although everything else will stay the same. An introduction, one of them will be an introduction to most, aimed at people who want to approach it from a conceptual perspective, and the other will be aimed primarily at methodologists. So that the second one is a little bit more technical. So watch for that. There'll be announcements about that. And we also sometimes do synchronous online trainings. They're based on the asynchronous training, so you have to complete the asynchronous training. But the synchronous training, there's tremendous value added here because it will help you to relate the ideas directly to your own work. And our objective here is to prepare you to write a successful grant proposal that involves most. So watch the website and our newsletter for the dates of our next training. There'll be a training in the next one will be May 2023. And our objective is to do
Linda.
Yes.
We can tell people the exact dates.
Okay, you guys are hearing it here first. No one else knows this. Okay, Kate, go ahead.
True story. So the next training will be the week of May 22nd. And the application to attend that training will be released on February 15th. You can find that information on the website. And we'll also send it out through emails, make sure that you know about it. The application is not especially onerous. Some people on this call today have been in that training, so they can back me up. It's really won't take too much of your time, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, we have to have an application because there's always more interest than we have seats in trainings, and so we just try to make sure to we try to make sure people have the background that they need to get something out of the course. That's our main objective. So there's a lot more resources on cadio.org. So please, take a look at the website. There's FAQs. There's more information about intervention optimization. There's recommended readings, just all kinds of stuff on there. So I think that was my last. I can't forget that. Sign up for our newsletter, please. Go to the website and sign up for the newsletter, because that is where you will hear the latest. That is where we will be announcing things like trainings, and also follow us on Twitter. It's at Cadio_NYU. Okay. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing, and I am here for questions and comments and arguments. I'm open to arguments. In fact, I love arguments.
I got a question. One of the things I've been struggling with most is what constitutes a component, like how big or small a component should be. So I'm curious if you can just talk a little bit about that. Yes,
that's a really great question. I don't know whether you've seen in the book, I did talk about the granularity of components. So that's what I call that question, the granularity of components. And I always say that if you can separate it out and it would be productive to do so, you can call it a component. So I wouldn't say that anything is sort of intrinsically a component or not a component for the most part. But there is kind of a trade-off with granularity. You can imagine like a really, really deep dive, and you'd be looking at these tiny grains of a component, and that might be, then, I mean, you potentially could learn a lot, but it would be resource intensive because you would have to have a lot of factors in a factorial experiment, or you would have to do a series of factorial experiments. And so your resource limitations partly determine the granularity. So I don't think the way to think about it is, oh gosh, this is somehow too granular or not granular enough. It's more like, well, these are it's kind of like the resource management principle, you know, that following that partly determines what level of granularity you're going to go for. Does that answer your question, Carly?
Could I just add to that, Carly, that to this point of granularity, a component could be an entire intervention, right? Or it could be a piece. And so sometimes just pointing that out is helpful. It could be the entire kit and caboodle about motivational interviewing, or you could break it up into other aspects.
That's
Yeah.
extremely helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, and the continual optimization principle says that you're going to be doing future optimization trials. You're not going to answer every question you have in one optimization trial. So what, you know, you can start with less granular components, and then as you learn more, work toward more granular components.
Thank you. Super helpful.
Elizabeth, you're unmuted. Do you have a question?
No, I'm just thinking.
Okay.
So, well, I guess so, and I'm coming from the randomized clinical trial, you know, mindset. But is there a certain effect size that that has been proposed in other studies that would guide your level of granularity? Like, I mean, if it has an infinitesimally small effect size, then breaking that down into a further granular level seems like that you would need, you know, that there would be some questions as to whether it would be fruitful to do that analysis. I don't know. But like I said, I'm sort of wrapping my head around all of it.
Well, you know, let me say that most is a really different way of thinking. And so it's very foreign at first. People do get used to it pretty quickly. And then once they do, most people don't go back to thinking the old way, but it is kind of confusing at first. So I completely get that. But what you just said, Elizabeth, I think is a really great intuition. And it's kind of what I meant by your resources partly determine how granular you can go, the granularity of your components. So you can look at these tiny fine-grained components, they're going to have a smaller effect, right? And so it's going to take a larger N to power, all else being equal. And so yeah, you have to ask yourself whether that's worth it. And it might be, or it might not be. I mean, it's impossible to make a blanket statement about that.
Well, and right, the thing that happens is we recycle the same components from intervention to intervention, and we don't know that effect size. And so, like, just want to mention that the benefit of this approach is that contribution as well. So if, you know, I hate to pick on motivational interviewing, it's just the first thing that always comes to my mind, but like, if that doesn't work, then stop including it, or we need to do better to refine what that looks like.
Yeah, let me make another, that's a really good point, Kate, and it got me thinking about a related question that people often ask, which is sort of what's the basis for deciding on the effect size when you're powering an optimization trial? And there's two different ways you can go about that. One way you can go about it is the kind of usual, what I'll call the usual way, which is you kind of scour the literature to try to find what is a likely effect size and then sort of go with that. The other approach, and the one I actually recommend, is a little bit different. I recommend thinking about what's the minimum effect you would want a component to demonstrate to be eligible to be included in your intervention. So in other words, how well would a component have to perform in order to get its coveted place in your intervention? And you get to decide that, and then you power accordingly, because if in reality that component's effect size is less than that, you don't care what the effect size is. So you don't have to, you don't have to power to detect a really, really small effect. You're just trying to find the components that have a large enough effect for you to want to include them. Does that make sense? Yeah, and as Kate pointed out in the chat, I guess I forgot to mention this, the Coursera course is free. You have to pay some money to get like a certificate. And so, if you want the certificate, then pay the money, but most people don't need the certificate. So I usually recommend not bothering with it. So you're all going to run out and use most, I hope.
Shelley.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi. I had a question. Thinking about pilot studies. So there are a number of internal pilot grants I could apply to, and I'm just trying to think, like, for every pilot study I now do, should I be pitching a pilot optimization trial? So like 32 people, some sort of factorial. I'm trying to think through how to pilot studies now.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to duck it a little bit by saying that it depends on what you need to prepare yourself for an R01. So you have a K award, right, Michelle? So the purpose of a pilot study is to help prepare you for that R01. And so the question is, what do you need? Now, I feel that you're in the strongest position in particular as a junior investigator applying for an R01 if you actually pilot tested the entire optimization trial. And part of the reason for this is the reviewers want to know two things. They want to know three things, actually. One of them they shouldn't want to know. But the two things that I think are legitimate are, are all the components acceptable to participants? Can you implement them the way you thought you could? All those sort of practical. The second one is with junior people who don't have a lot of experience with field experimentation. The reviewers, I think, legitimately want to know that you've thought through what it takes to conduct, a 16 condition or 32 condition experiment in a field setting. And so showing that you've piloted that and done it successfully, and here's what we learned, and sharing, here's our materials, and how we're going to go about this, tremendously helpful. The third thing reviewers sometimes want is like some kind of preliminary evidence that the components work, and that I think is not an appropriate ask, but nobody asked me, so. But anyway, so that's what I would say, that you want to pilot so that you can demonstrate that the components are working the way you thought, and you can do what you thought you could with them, and then that how to conduct an optimization trial without incurring a lot of protocol deviations.
Yeah, thanks. That makes sense.
Okay, Emily.
Hello. Hi. I think I have a very similar question. So I'm also thinking about a career development award utilizing most, and I'm at a very early stage in that. And so aside from pilot testing the components together, I'm interested in how I define that optimization objective. So is it appropriate at a very early, almost feasibility acceptability level to say, I want to do this all for X number of dollars? Or is it appropriate to say, you know, I've thought about the cost and all of these options will be within something that is reasonable. But what I really want to know is if I can do it, right? And so I think that's where I'm struggling with the earlier stage.
Are you talking about what you would be proposing to do in a K award?
Correct.
Yeah. So my opinion is that in a K award, you can't conduct a fully powered optimization trial. There's just not, there's typically, I mean, there are some exceptions to that, but generally speaking, you can't. And so you should use the resources of the K to help you figure out what kind of optimization objective you want when you do the optimization trial. But when we're talking about cost here, and this is, I just want to point out to everyone that when we're talking about cost here, we're talking about implementation cost when the intervention goes to scale. We're not talking about what it costs to conduct an optimization trial, or what it costs to implement an intervention as part of an R01. I mean, you want to have a handle on that so that you can budget the application, but that's not what we're talking about for optimization. For Ks, I usually recommend that you propose to do some secondary analyses that will inform development of a beautiful conceptual model. That's what you need, is to develop a beautiful conceptual model, really detailed and thoughtful conceptual model. That in and of itself will probably be publishable in sort of a review article type thing. Mm-hmm. And then of course, you'll probably get some interesting findings with the secondary analyses. And then plan a pilot optimization trial with a beautiful and very, very well specified conceptual model and a pilot optimization trial. You will be in good shape to land an R01.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Just want to be mindful of time and say, take this opportunity to say, Emily, there are a good number of examples of funded career development awards that use most. Several people today on the call have one. And so lots of opportunity for that. There's also the special interest group at the Society of Behavioral Medicine that has a special webinar specifically about K awards and most. And so Emily, if you want a link to that, feel free to shoot me an email and I can direct you to that. We have about one more minute.
John O'Neill has his hand up.
Yes, hi, Dr. Collins. Just a quick question for you. I'm working around in a trial right now, in a pilot rather, and social support by Susan Mickey in terms of as a behavior change technique turns up. And I'm just curious, when I listen to you talk about the interaction of components, when it comes time to actually moving into, something a bit more serious that looks like an optimization trial, how do you begin to sort of put together something that's kind of a bit more complex, like social support as a component? Mm-hmm. I'm just curious, have you had experience with it, or do you have a best practice? Because to me, I would have difficulty conceptualizing how I would do that.
So are you talking about putting together the treatment part of it, or are you talking about the experimental design part of it?
Well, so it's an exercise sort of intervention, if you will, or physical activity intervention. And so there's a social support component that seems to be effective, but I don't really know why. So like beginning to then try and distill that into a hypothesized component that's lower than social support. I don't really, I'm just curious if you've come across research that does a good job at that, or, just encourage me to keep plugging and try and define the component.
Kate, this is a little more your department. Can you answer this?
John, I think there's a lot of room for more discussion about this, and there's a lot of intersection between BCTs and intervention optimization. So just in the interest of time to say probably keep digging, there is some good resources out there, but feel free to contact us and we can set up times to talk more.
Okay, thank you. Sorry.
Yeah. All right. we're on time. This is my job to keep Linda on time. Thank you all very much for joining us today, and we will see you hopefully at another webinar.
This is great. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Bye-bye.